I didn't catch her cheating in a dramatic way, no shouting. No secrets uncovered in a rage, just a quiet moment in my own kitchen where nothing felt right. Like the house knew something I didn't yet. 17 years married. 3 kids asleep upstairs. A life that looked stable from every angle that mattered. And there I was standing barefoot on cold tile at midnight, staring at a phone that wasn't mine, glowing like it had been waiting for me, realizing with a sinking clarity that the danger wasn't what I was about to discover, but how easily I could still walk away, reheat my food, go to bed, and let tomorrow pretend this moment never happened. Because the scariest part of trust isn't betrayal, it's how long you can live comfortably before you notice it's already gone. Have you ever walked into your own kitchen and felt like something was wrong before you could explain why? Like the air itself was holding a secret it didn't want to give up yet. Because that's exactly how my life cracked open, not with a scream or a fight, but with a quiet moment that should have meant nothing at all. 17 years married, 3 kids, a house big enough to echo when everyone's gone, a career that looked impressive on paper, and a marriage I genuinely believed was solid, dependable, unbreakable in that boring, adult way where nothing feels urgent anymore. And that was the problem, because comfort slowly teaches you to stop checking, stop asking, stop noticing the small shifts that signal something is slipping away. And I was very good at not noticing, at convincing myself that long hours, missed dinners, and exhausted conversations were just the price of building a life, not the cost of losing one. From the outside, we were the couple people pointed to as proof that balance was possible, successful careers, healthy kids, no public drama, and I let that image replace the reality of what it actually felt like to be married to someone you rarely looked at long enough to really see, someone who smiled on schedule, moved on routine, and knew exactly how to play the role of everything's fine, while something underneath quietly decayed. I told myself distance was normal, that passion fades, that adulthood is about responsibility, not excitement, and I swallowed that lie because it was easier than admitting I'd stopped being curious about my own marriage, easier than asking uncomfortable questions about why late nights were becoming standard, why phones were always face down, why conversations felt transactional instead of connected. And the scariest part wasn't that I suspected anything. It was that I didn't suspect anything at all. Because when you trust the image more than your instincts, you stop listening to the voice that says pay attention. That night, I thought I was just coming home late, reheating leftovers, ending another long week the same way I always did, unaware that the life I believed I was protecting had already been living a double existence, and that all it would take to expose it was one ordinary room, one careless moment, and a glowing screen that refused to go dark. I didn't go looking for anything that night, and that's what makes the memory impossible to shake. Because it wasn't suspicion that found me, it was habit. The phone was sitting on the kitchen counter where it never stayed, screen glowing softly in the dark like it had been left mid-thought, and I almost ignored it, told myself it wasn't my place, that adults don't check each other's phones, that trust means letting small things pass. But trust also assumes nothing is hiding in plain sight, and when I finally glanced down, it wasn't anything dramatic or obvious, just a name I didn't recognize and a short message preview that felt too familiar to be harmless, the kind of unfinished sentence that assumes the conversation has been alive long before you arrived. My first reaction wasn't anger, it was embarrassment, a quiet, internal kind that made me feel foolish for standing there in my own kitchen holding something that didn't belong to me, and I even laughed under my breath, trying to force an explanation that wouldn't require panic, that wouldn't demand I question the life I thought I understood. But then the screen lit up again, another message sliding in effortlessly, relaxed, unguarded, and something in my body tightened before my mind caught up, because familiarity like that doesn't appear by accident. It forms over time, and I didn't need to read any further to understand what that meant. My thoughts jumped to the kids asleep upstairs, to bills already scheduled, to plans already made, all of it stacked neatly in place while something underneath began to shift. And the danger wasn't what I might discover next, it was how easy it would be to put the phone back down, reheat my food, and pretend this moment never happened. But as I stood there in the dark kitchen, the phone warm in my hand, I understood this wasn't the discovery yet, it was the point of no return, where I either faced what this meant right now, tonight, in this house, or knowingly stepped back into a life that would never feel solid again. Once that possibility existed, my mind stopped moving forward and started replaying moments I'd dismissed as insignificant. And the more I revisited them, the less accidental any of it felt. I thought about the gym, how I'd been the one to suggest it when the space between us started feeling routine, how I framed it as self-care and confidence, something she deserved after years of carrying the weight of our life, and how proud I'd felt watching her change, believing I was being supportive while quietly redirecting attention I no longer had the energy to give. I remembered the trainer she mentioned casually at first, the way his name surfaced just often enough to notice and just softly enough to ignore, and I remembered laughing it off, convincing myself jealousy was weakness and trust was strength, that secure men don't ask questions that make them uncomfortable, and that belief kept me still while something around me was clearly moving. I measured my contribution in ways that were easy to track: bills paid, schedules managed, responsibilities handled, while withdrawing from the parts of marriage that don't offer immediate feedback, the parts that require curiosity, emotional effort, and presence without control. And I didn't notice how that absence created space. Not suddenly, but gradually, the way silence grows when no one interrupts it. I hadn't been pushed aside all at once. I'd slowly made room, mistaking reliability for intimacy and consistency for connection, telling myself this was what long marriages become: that intensity fades, that stability replaces attention, and those ideas protected me from effort while lowering the standard for closeness. What unsettled me wasn't the comparison itself, but how easily I'd dismissed it, how often I'd congratulated myself for being secure when what I really was disengaged, choosing comfort over curiosity and routine over involvement because it felt responsible and adult. I saw how often I'd leaned back instead of in, how many small chances I'd had to notice the shift and chose not to, calling distance normal, calling silence peaceful, calling absence maturity, until those choices stacked quietly on top of each other. Standing there with that realization, there was no satisfaction in understanding it, no relief in naming it, only the uncomfortable awareness that this wasn't just about what she'd done, it was about how long I'd allowed a version of our marriage to exist that required less of me emotionally. And that awareness didn't settle me, it pressed forward, demanding a response I couldn't delay much longer. The next morning, I moved through the house like everything was normal because reacting would have meant revealing something I wasn't ready to explain. And once reactions escape, they can't be taken back. I spoke when spoken to, nodded when expected, and paid attention in a way I hadn't before, noticing how smoothly she filled silence, how effortless the routine felt, how practiced the ordinary had become, and it struck me that whatever I was only beginning to understand, she'd already rehearsed living with. I didn't confront her or ask questions, not because I wasn't tempted, but because instinct told me that answers given too early are usually incomplete, and incomplete answers have a way of rewriting themselves later. Instead, I started watching patterns quietly, nothing obsessive, nothing dramatic, just enough to see repetition, times that didn't line up, explanations that arrived a beat too prepared, habits that shifted without explanation, and I wrote them down without attaching emotion. Because emotion clouds patterns and patterns are what make lies visible. As the day went on, that restraint turned deliberate, and I realized how quickly emotion fades when it doesn't have an audience, how clarity replaces panic when you stop demanding immediate relief. I saved what appeared naturally, noted what repeated itself, and resisted the urge to dig deeper than necessary, reminding myself that the goal wasn't confirmation, it was understanding. And understanding takes patience. That night, lying beside her, listening to the same breathing I'd trusted for years, the distance felt sharper than anger would have, not dramatic or explosive, just undeniable, and I understood how dangerous confrontation would be without preparation, how easily it would trade certainty for chaos. By then, The calm I felt wasn't numbness or denial. It was control taking shape. A decision to stay quiet long enough to protect myself from acting on impulse instead of information. Because once the truth surfaced, it would change everything, and I needed to be certain I was ready for what followed. Not because I wanted revenge or validation, but because the next move I made would determine whether this stayed a moment of confusion, or became something I couldn't step back from. Once I stopped reacting and started paying attention, the lies became less shocking and more procedural, like something she'd rehearsed until it no longer required effort. And what unsettled me wasn't their size but their consistency. Mornings unfolded the same way they always had, coffee poured. Routines followed. Casual affection delivered on schedule, and if I hadn't known what I knew, nothing would have felt off. Which was exactly the point. Because the lie wasn't just what she said. It was how smoothly it fit into our life. She mentioned a late meeting without hesitation. Dropped it into conversation with just enough detail to sound responsible and just little enough to avoid questions. And I watched how easily it landed. How naturally it blended into our rhythm. Realizing this explanation hadn't been created for me, it had been perfected over time. There was no pause. No searching for words. No uncertainty. Just confidence. And that confidence did more convincing than any evidence ever could. Repetition hadn't just made the lie believable. It had made it feel routine. Like I was wrong for even noticing it. I nodded. Asked nothing. And felt something unfamiliar settle in. Not anger. Not sadness, but distance. The quiet kind that forms when you realize you're no longer part of the truth-telling process in your own relationship. Every excuse sounded reasonable on its own. Every justification made sense in isolation. But stacked together they formed a pattern that refused to disappear. She moved through the day with the ease of someone who wasn't worried about being caught. Because nothing about her behavior invited scrutiny. And that calm was louder than any confession would have been. I understood then that gaslighting doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it's built into routines, reinforced by trust, and protected by the listener's desire for stability. By evening, I wasn't wondering if something was happening anymore. I was watching how long it had been happening. How many times this same explanation had been delivered. How many versions of this day I'd already lived without noticing the repetition. Sitting across from her, listening to another perfectly reasonable reason for being late. The last trace of doubt drained away, replaced not by relief but by certainty. Because once you recognize a lie being repeated without effort, you also recognize how carefully the truth has been kept out, and certainty, once it arrives, doesn't ask permission to stay. Certainty didn't arrive in a rush. It settled the moment I stopped guessing and started verifying. Because suspicion invites arguments but facts don't negotiate. And that morning I understood I didn't need to wonder what was happening anymore. I needed to know where it was happening. The house moved through its routine like nothing had shifted, alarms buzzing, footsteps overhead, doors opening and closing, and in the middle of that normalcy sat the one object that could answer everything without emotion. Her phone, charging where she'd left it, face down like always. And picking it up felt less like crossing a line and more like finishing a thought that had already started. The passcode hadn't changed. Muscle memory opened it before doubt could interfere. And I didn't rush or scroll aimlessly. Because at this point I wasn't searching for proof of betrayal. I was looking for coordinates. The messages were there. Simple and unguarded. Written with the ease of people who didn't believe they were being watched. References to Friday. To the usual. To timing that assumed repetition, not planning, and tucked among them was the detail that collapsed every remaining question into something fixed, a restaurant name I recognized immediately. Quiet, expensive, the kind of place chosen specifically because it blends discretion with anonymity. I didn't imagine them sitting there or picture what they'd say, because imagination creates noise and noise wasn't useful, so I memorized instead. The reservation name, the time. The floor, how casually it was all discussed, like coordinating groceries rather than hiding a life. Once a place enters the equation, doubt disappears. Because places don't shift or reinterpret themselves. They exist, waiting exactly where they're supposed to be. I set the phone back where it had been. aligned the cord the same way, left no trace of interruption, and stood there longer than necessary, not shaken, not angry, just steady in a way I hadn't been since this began. The rest of the morning unfolded normally, small talk, familiar gestures, nothing visibly different, but everything underneath had changed, because when she mentioned being late again, said it casually like she always did, I didn't respond at all, not because I was hiding anything, but because reactions belong to uncertainty and uncertainty was gone. By the time I left the house, I wasn't carrying suspicion with me anymore. I was carrying a destination. And Friday was no longer a vague fear or distant idea. It was a real place with a real time attached to it. And once something becomes that specific, it stops being something that happens to you and becomes something you can walk toward on your own terms. Once I knew exactly where Friday was leading. The days before it didn't feel like waiting anymore. They felt like containment. Because waiting assumes doubt and there was none left. What I had was clarity. And clarity changes how you move through ordinary moments. It makes you quieter, more deliberate, less reactive, like conserving energy for something that hasn't happened yet but already exists. I didn't confront her or test her or push for reassurance. Because questions only benefit the person who still thinks they're ahead of the truth. And I wasn't interested in emotional exchanges that would tip my hand. I was interested in keeping everything stable until the right moment. Instead, I stayed consistent, woke up at the same time, followed the same routines, talked about the kids, schedules, mundane logistics, and watched how easily normalcy absorbs deception when it isn't challenged, how smoothly excuses land when they're expected to, how comfortable she seemed inside a version of reality she assumed I shared. Each day added weight, not new information, just confirmation. The kind that comes from observing how someone behaves when they believe they're safe. And the calm I felt wasn't numbness or denial, it was restraint, the kind that takes effort, because every instinct wants to act the moment certainty arrives. Friday existed quietly in the background of everything, not looming, not dramatic, just fixed, like a date circled on a calendar you don't look at too often because you don't need to. And I avoided imagining the scene ahead because imagination invites emotion, and emotion clouds timing. Instead, I focused on details that mattered: who would be where, how long things would take, what needed to stay untouched so nothing shifted prematurely. I paid closer attention to the kids, not sentimentally but protectively, making sure routine stayed intact, that nothing I did spilled into their awareness. Because whatever was coming didn't belong to them. Restraint became a daily discipline, resisting the urge to check the phone again, resisting the impulse to search for more proof I didn't need, reminding myself that certainty doesn't require reinforcement. By Thursday night, I wasn't restless or anxious. I was ready in a quiet way, clothes chosen, schedule cleared, nothing theatrical. Because theatrics announced themselves and I needed invisibility right up until the moment it mattered. When she mentioned Friday again, framed it casually as another late evening, I agreed without hesitation, no pause, no edge, and watched her relax in a way so subtle she probably didn't know she'd done it. A reflex that told me she still believed the situation was under her control, but it wasn't, because while she thought she was managing appearances, I was choosing when to stay silent. And silence, when it's deliberate, carries more weight than confrontation ever could. By the time I went to bed that night, Friday wasn't approaching me anymore, I was walking toward it on purpose. And she had no idea. We didn't meet in anger or desperation. And that was the first thing that surprised me, because when two people are pulled together by the same betrayal, you expect volatility, raised voices, emotion spilling everywhere. But what we shared instead was restraint. The quiet kind that shows up after confusion has already burned itself out. The cafe was neutral, public enough to feel safe, anonymous enough to disappear into. And when she walked in, there was no dramatic recognition or confrontation, just a brief moment where we both paused, measuring whether the other person could be trusted with something this exposed. We sat down without small talk. Not because we were cold, but because pleasantries feel dishonest when both of you already know why you're there. And the first thing we did wasn't accuse or speculate. It was line up facts. Timelines laid next to each other. Dates checked against calendars. Absences compared with unsettling precision. And as the overlaps stacked, the room seemed to narrow around the table. Not from emotion, but from clarity. Like watching two incomplete maps lock into place. Neither of us raised our voices or lost control. Not because it didn't hurt, but because pain had already done its work before we arrived. And what mattered now was accuracy. Understanding how long this had been happening, how often, and how deliberately it had been folded into the ordinary spaces of our lives without either of us noticing. Hearing her describe the same distance, the same unexplained changes, the same internal debate about whether noticing meant overreacting, stripped away the last residue of doubt. Because when your experiences mirrored this precisely, denial has nowhere left to hide. We spoke carefully, not to protect them, but to protect ourselves from mistakes. Because once facts are acknowledged out loud, they stop being flexible, they harden, and mishandling them creates damage far beyond their source. At one point she went quiet, stared at the table, and admitted she'd suspected something for months but couldn't prove it. And that admission carried more weight than any screenshot, because it revealed how long uncertainty can erode someone before certainty ever arrives. Without saying it directly, we both understood that whatever came next needed to be controlled, not reactive, because chaos only serves the people who created the situation. And as we stood to leave, there was no sense of closure or comfort, just alignment. The recognition that this truth had crossed a line it couldn't be pulled back from. Because once two people say the same facts out loud in the same room, pretending nothing has changed is no longer an option. Once the truth was fully laid out, the next step wasn't confrontation, it was structure. Because reacting would have handed control back to the very people who'd taken it without asking, and I wasn't willing to do that. Anger feels productive in the moment, but it creates noise. And noise makes mistakes, so I kept everything quiet and focused on sequence instead. What needed to happen first, what needed to stay unchanged, and what had to be present when the moment arrived. Friday already existed as a fixed point, the time and place confirmed beyond doubt, so everything else became about placement rather than punishment, ensuring that when it unfolded, nothing could be denied or redirected afterward. I didn't picture shouting or scenes or public humiliation, because those fantasies collapse as soon as someone starts explaining. And I didn't want explanations, I wanted a situation that spoke for itself. The plan didn't arrive all at once, it assembled gradually, small choices stacking into something precise. Who would be there? Where each person would sit? What would be seen without being announced? How silence could do more work than words ever could. I thought about how deception survives, how it depends on separation, on different versions of reality never intersecting, and it became obvious that the simplest way to end that was to remove the distance, to place the truth in the same room and let it exist without commentary. There was a steady calm in thinking this way, almost procedural, because when each detail is intentional, emotion has less room to interfere, and timing mattered more than anything. Arriving too early invites suspicion. Arriving too late invites chaos. So everything was built around precision. I didn't rehearse conversations or prepare speeches. Because dialogue creates openings and openings create escape routes. And escape was exactly what I was eliminating. Even restraint became part of the design. No sudden changes in behavior. No last-minute checks. No emotional leaks. Because the success of what was coming depended on appearing exactly as I always had. As the final pieces settled, doubt disappeared, not because I felt powerful, but because power wasn't the objective. Inevitability was. Creating a moment that would continue without intervention once set in motion. I knew that once this began, there would be no undoing it, no stepping back into before, and that awareness didn't produce fear. It produced focus. The kind that narrows everything down to a single direction. By the time the plan was complete, there was no anticipation or adrenaline, just readiness. The quiet certainty that comes when nothing essential has been left to chance. Friday was no longer something I was bracing for, it was something already in progress. And all that remained was to arrive and let the truth occupy the space it had been avoiding. The days between knowing and acting stretched in a way I hadn't experienced before. Not dramatic or chaotic, just heavy, like every ordinary moment required more effort to move through. And on the surface nothing changed. Mornings still began with alarms and rushed breakfasts, backpacks by the door, schedules discussed in fragments, the familiar choreography of a household that knows how to function efficiently. And that sameness was what made it heavier. Because routine is convincing when you let it be. It creates the illusion that stability still exists even when you know it doesn't. I stayed consistent on purpose. Not distant and not overly attentive. Just exactly who I'd always been. Because any shift would have raised questions I wasn't ready to answer yet. And I watched how easily daily life keeps moving when only one person is carrying the full weight of the truth. She moved through the week with a lightness I hadn't seen in a while. Distracted but energized. Smiling at her phone, present and absent at the same time, and noticing that didn't spark anger so much as clarity, because it showed me how separate our inner worlds already were. The kids sensed something without being able to name it, the way they lingered longer, asked the same questions twice, paid closer attention to tone and timing, and I made sure their routines stayed intact, homework checked, dinners on time, conversations steady. Because whatever was coming didn't belong to them yet. Nights were the hardest. Lying beside someone who spoke casually about plans I wasn't part of. Listening to stories shaped carefully for an audience that had already changed. And it took discipline not to react. Not to pull away. Not to let my body signal what my words hadn't. So I grounded myself in details instead. The quiet sounds of the house. The rhythm of breathing. The small markers of a life that still looked intact if you didn't examine it closely. Each day carried Friday closer without announcing it, and I avoided counting hours or replaying scenarios because imagination creates volatility, and volatility creates mistakes. So I stayed anchored in what was happening rather than what was coming. There were moments when ending it early felt tempting, confronting her in the kitchen or the hallway just to release the pressure of holding everything alone. But I let those moments pass, reminding myself that timing isn't about relief, it's about control. By Thursday night, the week had done its work, not by exhausting me, but by confirming something quietly important, that I could carry this without breaking, that I didn't need to rush to be heard, and that when the moment arrived, I would be ready. When Friday morning came, it didn't feel dramatic or ominous, it felt unnervingly calm, and as she got ready, humming lightly, talking about her day like nothing was different, I understood that she was walking into the evening certain and unguarded, while I was walking into it fully aware, and that difference was about to matter. Getting ready that evening didn't feel ceremonial or dramatic, it felt deliberate, like preparing for a meeting where the outcome was already decided but the execution still mattered, and I moved through the routine slowly, intentionally, not because I was nervous, but because speed invites mistakes and mistakes hand control back to emotion. I chose my clothes with more care than I had in years, not to impress anyone, but to align myself with the version of me that needed to walk into that room calm and unshaken. The man who didn't need to raise his voice to be heard, who didn't need to perform anger to justify pain. And as I buttoned my shirt and checked my reflection, what struck me most wasn't how composed I looked, but how detached I felt. Like I'd already stepped past the point where reactions mattered. The house was quiet in that late evening way, kids settled, lights dimmed, routines finished, and that normalcy felt almost surreal, knowing how sharply the night was about to bend away from it. But I didn't linger on that thought, because sentimentality dulls focus, and focus was the only thing I couldn't afford to lose. I replayed nothing in my head, not the messages, not the lies, not the possible outcomes, because rehearsing arguments creates expectations, and expectations create disappointment when reality takes its own path. So instead I anchored myself in simple truths, that I knew what I knew, that I had verified it, that I wasn't walking in to ask questions but to end uncertainty. When I checked the time, I noticed how close it was to 8 and felt no rush. only a steady readiness. The kind that comes when decisions have already been made privately and all that's left is to make them visible. As I stepped outside, the air felt sharper, cooler, grounding, and the drive itself passed in silence. No music, no calls, just the hum of the road and the clarity that comes when there's nothing left to debate internally. I arrived a few minutes late on purpose, not as a tactic, but as a signal to myself that I was no longer adjusting my pace to anyone else's expectations. And as I walked toward the entrance, I didn't feel anger or anticipation. I felt alignment, the rare calm that comes when your actions finally match what you already understand to be true. Whatever happened inside that room would happen whether I entered confidently or not. But composure was the one variable fully under my control, and as the doors came into view, I knew I wasn't stepping into confrontation. I was stepping into clarity, and once clarity arrives, there's no pretending left to protect. The room revealed itself before I reached the table, not because I was searching for them, but because familiarity has weight, and when two people are somewhere they shouldn't be together, it shows in how they occupy space. Leaning inward, voices lowered, attention narrowed into a private orbit that shuts everything else out. I saw it immediately. The angle of her shoulders, the ease of her posture, the way her hand rested where it wouldn't have if this were innocent. Comfort disguised as novelty, routine pretending to be excitement. I didn't slow my pace or hesitate, because hesitation would have turned this into a scene before it needed to be one. And the distance closed naturally, step by step, table by table, until the moment arrived without warning. She looked up first, eyes lifting mid-sentence, a smile still forming, and I watched the exact instant recognition landed, confusion flashing briefly before disbelief took over. Then something colder, something that drained the color from her face faster than fear ever could, because fear suggests preparation, and she hadn't prepared for this. Her body reacted before her thoughts did, posture stiffening, her hand pulling back as if it had touched heat, and in that silent second before anyone spoke, the truth moved faster than language. He followed her gaze a moment later, turning just enough to register me, then far enough to notice who was with me, and whatever confidence he'd brought into the room collapsed immediately, because confidence depends on isolation, and isolation was gone. The space around the table grew dense, not loud or chaotic, just heavy with attention, nearby conversations thinning without intention, because moments like this announce themselves without sound. No one spoke, and that pause mattered more than any accusation, because it forced reality to exist fully before anyone could reshape it, and behind their eyes I could see the scramble begin, not outward panic, but the rapid recalculation of stories, timelines, exits, the reflex to regain control where none remained. I didn't sit right away or gesture, I simply stood where I could be seen, letting the imbalance settle, letting the difference between secrecy and exposure become unavoidable, and only when pretending was no longer an option did I pull the chair back and take my seat. Calm, measured, unmistakably present. She tried to speak, stopped, tried again, but whatever script she'd rehearsed for tonight hadn't included this configuration, and the absence of words said everything. This wasn't confrontation yet, it was recognition, the irreversible shift from hidden to visible, from controlled to uncertain, and as I met her eyes across that narrow space, I understood with absolute clarity that whatever story they thought they were living ended the moment eye contact was made, because once a truth is seen by everyone involved, it can't be negotiated back into secrecy, only carried forward. By the time the truth finally surfaced between us, it didn't arrive as an explosion or a confession pulled out of guilt. It arrived as language that felt rehearsed long before I ever heard it, and that's when I understood this moment wasn't about discovery anymore. It was about control. She didn't deny what I knew. She reframed it, softened it, described it as something that had grown quietly, something that was never meant to hurt anyone. Phrases meant less to explain than to dull the impact, to turn deliberate choices into unfortunate circumstances. As she spoke, I realized how dangerous familiarity can be, because when someone knows you well, they know exactly which words sound reasonable, Which ones sound responsible? Which ones make betrayal feel like confusion instead of intent? I listened without interrupting, not because I agreed, but because interruption gives people room to escalate, and escalation gives them something to hide behind. And I didn't want noise. I wanted clarity. What stood out wasn't what she admitted, it was what she avoided. The way time disappeared from her version of events, how months became vague, how repetition was never named directly, because naming things makes them real, and reality was the one thing she seemed unwilling to sit with. There was no apology that existed on its own, no sentence that didn't try to balance responsibility with justification, and that balancing act told me more than anger ever could, because remorse that needs explanation is still negotiating. Something detached inside me as she talked. Not heartbreak exactly, but alignment. The moment confusion finally organizes itself and you stop asking questions not because you're out of them, but because you understand what kind of answers you're being given. When she paused, waiting for a response, I stayed quiet, because silence removes the illusion of control, and in that space her certainty cracked just enough to reveal fear underneath. The realization that words weren't fixing this the way they usually did. I told her I didn't need explanations anymore. That understanding motive wouldn't change impact. And that sentence landed harder than any accusation could have. Because it closed the door on negotiation. What changed everything wasn't the admission itself. It was recognizing that the story she was telling herself didn't fully include the damage. And once you see that, you stop hoping for repair and start preparing for separation. Emotionally, if not immediately. When the conversation ended, there was no resolution and no dramatic conclusion. Just the quiet certainty that this wasn't a misunderstanding waiting to be clarified. It was a fracture that had already chosen its direction. And from that moment forward the question was no longer whether this could be fixed, but how much honesty I was willing to require from a situation that had already shown me how easily words could be shaped to avoid it. What finally broke whatever illusion was left didn't come from confrontation or proof or raised voices. It came from words that were never meant for me to hear. Sentences written casually, confidently, without awareness of the damage they carried. And once spoken aloud they landed with a precision nothing else had matched. I didn't read everything. I didn't need to, because a few lines were enough to show how long this version of her had existed without me in it. How easily a shared life had been reduced into shorthand. Years compressed into inconvenience. Familiarity replaced by dismissal. And as those words settled between us I understood this wasn't about being replaced. It was about being edited out. The message wasn't cruel in a dramatic way. It was worse than that. It was efficient. The kind of language people use when they've already justified themselves and no longer feel the need to be careful. And what hurt wasn't comparison. It was certainty. The ease with which my role in her life had been reframed as something predictable and optional. My body reacted before my thoughts did. A tightening in my chest. Not panic or anger, but recognition. The quiet understanding that something essential had crossed a line it couldn't return from. Because actions can be argued. Motives can be debated, but you can't negotiate with the way someone speaks about you when they believe you'll never hear it. She tried to explain, to contextualize, said the words came from stress, from frustration, from a moment that didn't define her. But explanations arrived too late, because the damage wasn't in phrasing, it was in perspective, and perspective doesn't appear accidentally, it's built over time and reinforced through repetition. As she spoke, I realized this was the most honest glimpse I'd had, not because it was kind, but because it was unguarded, a window into how she'd been narrating our marriage elsewhere. And once you hear the version of yourself that exists when you're not in the room, it doesn't fade. What collapsed in that moment wasn't just trust, it was identity, the shared understanding of who we were to each other, because the person she described wasn't someone she was temporarily angry with. It was someone she had already left behind. There was a pause where she seemed to wait for me to defend myself, to argue my relevance. But I didn't. Because defending yourself against a story someone has already committed to only deepens the distance. And I wasn't willing to fight for a role I didn't ask to be written out of. Instead, clarity settled in. Not relief, not peace, but finality. the understanding that this wasn't a mistake waiting to be corrected or a phase to survive. It was a conclusion that had been forming quietly for a long time. The words remained unchanged, undeniable, and as I looked at her I knew that even if everything else could somehow be repaired, those sentences couldn't be unheard or softened. And in that quiet space, without shouting or spectacle, I accepted that the end hadn't come from betrayal alone. It had come from the certainty with which she no longer saw me as someone worth protecting. And once that realization takes hold, there's nothing left to argue for. The real fallout didn't happen in public or online or anywhere that could be paused or replayed. It happened at home, in the quiet spaces where routines used to live. Because consequences don't arrive loudly, they settle in and change how familiar things feel. The house looked the same when I walked back in. Shoes by the door, backpacks on the floor, lights left on in empty rooms. But something fundamental had shifted. Like the air itself was heavier. And every ordinary sound carried weight it didn't have before. I didn't gather everyone together or make announcements. Because families don't need speeches when something breaks. They need stability. And the kids sensed it immediately. Not through words but through absence. Through the way conversations shortened and eye contact lingered a second too long. When questions came, they weren't dramatic or accusatory. They were careful, practical. The kind of questions children ask when they're trying to figure out whether the ground beneath them is still solid. And answering them required more control than confrontation ever had. I chose my words with intention, explaining enough to be honest without asking them to carry confusion that wasn't theirs. And in that restraint I understood something clearly. Accountability feels different when the people listening are the ones you're responsible for protecting. The hardest moments weren't angry ones. They were quiet ones. When loyalty showed up in small ways. In who sat where. In who waited. In who watched closely. Trying to understand what had changed without being told directly. There were no slammed doors or dramatic scenes. Just a slow shift in rhythm. Dinners that felt shorter. Mornings that felt heavier. Routines that continued without the ease they used to carry. More than once I felt the urge to explain myself. To justify. To fill the silence. But I didn't. Because turning the aftermath into a defense only creates more instability. And what mattered more than being understood in those moments was being consistent. Present. Predictable. Over the days that followed. Reality settled in not through conversations but through behavior. Through showing up the same way every morning. Through reliability instead of reassurance. And I learned that repair at home doesn't happen through words. It happens through repetition. Nothing resolved all at once. And it wasn't supposed to. But a line did become clear between what could still be repaired and what couldn't. And that clarity brought responsibility instead of hope. Because hope can delay action. But responsibility demands it. The aftermath wasn't something to survive or rush through. It was something to move through carefully, knowing that how I handled the quiet days after would shape everything that came next. And that whatever consequences were still waiting hadn't finished revealing themselves yet. The consequences didn't arrive all at once or in the dramatic sequence people imagine when they think about fallout. They unfolded slowly, unevenly. Through conversations that didn't go as planned and outcomes that couldn't be controlled. Because accountability rarely shows up as a single event. It shows up as a series of doors quietly closing. There were practical changes first. Schedules shifting. Routines breaking apart. Decisions that had to be made without the comfort of certainty. And each one carried weight that couldn't be argued away. Because consequences don't respond to explanation. They respond to reality. Conversations with lawyers, administrators, and people who suddenly needed clarity stripped the situation of emotion and replaced it with process. And that shift was sobering. Because once something enters systems larger than you, intent stops mattering and outcomes become fixed. There were losses that couldn't be softened. Opportunities that disappeared without ceremony. Reputations that changed quietly rather than publicly. And what stood out most was how little spectacle any of it had. No announcements. No balance restored. Just adjustments that permanently altered the shape of everyday life. I didn't catalog these moments or present them as proof of fairness. Because measuring damage turns consequence into performance. And nothing about this felt performative. It felt procedural and final. What surprised me was how quickly emotion became irrelevant in those spaces. How little anger or explanation mattered once decisions were recorded and timelines were set. Because systems don't react to feeling, they react to facts. I felt the urge more than once to assign meaning to losses so they would hurt less. But that impulse faded as I realized consequences don't need interpretation to exist. They simply arrive and remain. Some outcomes were immediate, others surfaced later, but all of them shared the same effect. They reduced options, narrowed paths, and replaced ambiguity with limits. There was no satisfaction in watching things fall apart, no sense of justice being restored, just the steady understanding that actions don't need witnesses to carry weight. They carry it regardless. Consequence isn't about punishment, it's about limitation, about realizing certain choices permanently shrink the future even when no one is trying to make an example out of you. Through it all, I focused on what still required steadiness, showing up where presence mattered and staying quiet where noise would only create more loss. Because restraint was the only form of control left. By the time things began to settle, what remained wasn't victory or vindication. It was structure, a clearer understanding of what was no longer possible and what still was. And that clarity became the boundary that allowed the next phase to exist at all. Consequences don't explain themselves later. They define limits in real time. And once those limits are set, the only real choice left is whether you respect them or spend years resisting something that has already taken its place. Rebuilding didn't begin with optimism or motivation or some dramatic turning point. It began quietly, in the absence of chaos, when the days stopped demanding reaction and started allowing intention. Because healing doesn't announce itself, it reveals itself through what no longer hurts the same way. The house didn't suddenly feel lighter. The routines didn't magically regain ease. But there was space where tension used to live. And that space mattered more than happiness ever could in the beginning. I didn't rush to redefine myself or rewrite the story into something inspirational. Because rushing to feel better is just another way of avoiding what needs to be processed. So instead I focused on consistency. On doing the next right thing without needing it to feel meaningful yet. The kids adjusted slowly. Not because everything was okay, but because predictability returned. And predictability is how safety rebuilds itself after trust has been shaken. Through mornings that happen on time. Through promises that are kept without explanation. Through presence that doesn't waver when it would be easier to withdraw. I stopped measuring progress in emotional milestones and started measuring it in stability. In fewer questions at night. In laughter that wasn't forced. In conversations that didn't feel like they were tiptoeing around something fragile. There were moments when anger resurfaced. Moments when loss felt sharper than before. But those moments passed without taking over. Because they no longer defined the direction I was moving in. They were just reminders of where I'd been. Rebuilding also meant letting go of outcomes I couldn't control. Of narratives I didn't get to correct. Of closure that never arrived in the form I once expected. And accepting that peace doesn't come from understanding everything. It comes from no longer needing to. I didn't win anything in the conventional sense. There was no balance restored. No satisfaction in hindsight. But I didn't lose myself either. And that distinction became important over time. Because integrity isn't loud and it isn't rewarded immediately. It's quiet. It's steady. And it shows up in the choices you keep making long after no one is watching. The future didn't open up all at once. It narrowed first. Became simpler. More deliberate. Built around what could actually be sustained instead of what looked good from the outside. Rebuilding wasn't about replacing what was lost. It was about constructing something honest enough to stand without constant maintenance. Something that didn't rely on performance or denial to survive. As time passed, the story stopped feeling unfinished. Not because everything made sense, but because it no longer needed to. And that was when I understood that closure isn't a moment you arrive at. It's a posture you choose. One grounded in reality rather than regret. I didn't come out of this stronger in a dramatic way. But I came out clearer. And clarity turned out to be more valuable than strength ever was. Because it allowed me to move forward without carrying resentment as identity. Rebuilding didn't give me back what I lost. It gave me something quieter and more durable. A life that didn't depend on illusion. A sense of self that wasn't negotiated through someone else's choices. And the understanding that sometimes the most meaningful ending isn't about triumph or forgiveness. It's about walking away with your integrity intact and knowing that, for the first time in a long while, the ground beneath you is honest enough to stand on.